Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, depending on where you are connecting from today. My name is Camilla Dos Santos, and I am the program coordinator of the Healthy Relationships Initiative. Before we get started today, I will tell you a little bit about the Healthy Relationships Initiative, also known as HRI. But I also wanted to extend my gratitude to Healthy UNCG and Stephanie Milroy for this partnership today. Through HRI, we are always grateful to partner with others to provide relationship education programming. And today, our program is Setting Boundaries When Working from Home, which is a pretty relevant topic in the world that we're living in today. So we're glad that you are connecting with us, and we look forward to spending this hour together. So as promised, I did want to just put in the plug about the Healthy Relationships Initiative because our work has really shifted throughout this pandemic to offer online resources to strengthen relationships of all kinds. So before the pandemic, we would do a lot of face-to-face relationship education and professional trainings for mental health professionals in Guilford County, North Carolina. But now we've been able to shift a little bit, and that's actually in line with our plan of wanting to be more mainstream and hopefully provide resources for the entire country and the entire world. And I do think we have some folks connecting with us today from outside of the United States, so we're really excited about that. To learn a little bit more about HRI, we do encourage you to check out our social media for daily relationship tips, as well as resources through our HRI blog and other webinars that we do as well. Our website is www.guilfordhri.org, and that's a really great place to connect with all of our educational resources. So today's objectives, we're going to dive into the pandemic and how it's affected the future of work. And then we're going to get into some of the challenges and the benefits of working from home. Once we get through that, we're going to really dive into what you're here for today, which is how do we set boundaries? What boundaries do we set? And then perhaps most importantly, how do we keep them? And then we're also going to talk a little bit about what happens when we might not be coping with stress and what signs we need to look out for to prevent burnout. And we know that burnout is becoming more prevalent, especially in this pandemic. And as I mentioned, towards the end of today's session, you will have time to ask me some questions. So let's get started. One thing that's really important to note is we don't exactly know what the pandemic is going to do to the workforce long term. But it's likely that remote work is here to stay in some fashion and for some time. And in fact, many companies have already said, we're working from home for the remainder of the year, or like Twitter has recently said, we're working from home forever. So we know that this is really impacting the workforce. And I did have a quick little video to just kind of get us thinking about the future of what work will look like, both in the United States and beyond.
For millions, the reality of working from home could be permanent. Twitter CEO Jack Dorsey telling his employees they can work remotely forever, from anywhere. As many industries grapple with how to redesign office space to minimize health risks, the historic economic crisis is also forcing companies to cut costs, potentially putting expensive real estate on the chopping block. NBC's Jacob Ward.
Bay Area tech companies were among the very first in the nation to send their people home. And Google and Facebook now say that their employees will mostly work remote for the rest of the year.
Some of New York's biggest tenants, Barclays and JP Morgan Chase, say they may not bring all employees back to the office at the same time. Austin-based Dell says more than half of its 160,000 staffers may never return to their desks. Emptier offices across the country will have a devastating ripple effect on local businesses.
Many restaurants and bars rely on the weekday lunch rush and crowds at happy hour. Florists count on those big corporate orders and that bouquet on the way home. Even parking garages where business depends on commuters showing up to the office.
With people not working from home, there's definitely been a drop.
While not every worker has the luxury of working from home, those who do could save money and time. The average commute adds up to 22 workdays a year, and you'd save up to $4,000 annually on that commute. Work clothing, dry cleaning, and yes, even coffee.
For companies, it saves money, it increases productivity, it increases agility. And for the planet, we just cannot deny what this has done in a very short period of time.
Redefining life and work at Home Sweet Home. Jolene Kent, NBC News, Los Angeles.
Hey, NBC News.
So that short little clip really just touches on the fact that regardless of where you live or what industry you may work in, it's likely that the workforce is going to be impacted long-term by this pandemic. But despite all of these changes and the fact that they were certainly unexpected, about 50% of people surveyed through LinkedIn last month do believe that working from home can succeed in most industries long-term. So we're going to talk a little bit more about that, but I think what's important to note is that the future of work is pretty much unknown at this point, but we can probably expect that we'll be working remotely in some capacity for some time, which is a pretty good idea for us to start setting some boundaries now then. So first, I did want to get us in the chat room talking and communicating. And so my question for you all today is, what are some of the challenges that you or others you know may be facing as a result of working from home? So these could be things that maybe you struggled with or others that you know have struggled with. And as these are coming in the chat room, I will sort of peek and take a look, but then we'll also get into some of the challenges that I came up with today. And I do see that the chat room is that you are you're putting some things in the chat room. So that's great. No decompression time and separation is one of the submissions, and we'll definitely get into that. But the first one that I wanted to address today really has to do with communication, whether we're talking about under communicating or over communicating. That's certainly been a challenge for many of us working from home. And in fact, LinkedIn did a survey recently that basically most workers feel as if the number one challenge they're facing right now is around communication. Whether that means we don't know necessarily what our expectations are or what our supervisor's expectations of us are, or whether that means that you're just being overloaded with emails and Zoom calls and phone calls. And so when we're either facing under or over communication, this can lead to some other stressors, but ultimately it's really been the number one challenge that people have been vocalizing since working from home. So communication is always a big deal when we think about how we feel in our relationships, especially our work relationships. Another challenge has to do with lack of clarity about expectations. And this is something that we might have faced even prior to the pandemic, but it really speaks volumes to how we work now, because when we don't know what our supervisors expect from us, or we don't know exactly what is expected, it makes it hard for us to know whether we're being productive or whether we're planning and managing our time effectively. And so lack of clarity about the expectations of your work and how you accomplish your work is really one of the bigger challenges of working from home as well. And one thing that's important to note, and I didn't mention this earlier in this slide, is that although many people in many industries have been working from home for quite a while, there's a big difference in having a job that's been designed to work remotely versus a job that you've had to adapt to working remotely. And that's part of the challenge as well, right? Many of us can accomplish our jobs remotely, but we didn't have any preparation time in order to do so. And that's a challenge in and of itself. The next challenge is why we're here today, right? Which is a lack of boundaries. And with that is also this idea of lack of clarity about what you are supposed to be doing for work, as well as your other priorities as well. And so some questions that come up when we don't have boundaries are, what are my expectations? Do I have the flexibility to work outside of the 9 to 5? Do I need to answer this email right now? Do I need to be available for phone calls from 9 to 5? And so when we don't have these ideas about what these work boundaries are, we can really start to feel some stress around them. In addition to sort of these boundaries, we're doing everything all of the time now. Many of us are parenting from home, we're working from home, we're fielding all of these things that happen on a daily basis, from the mailman knocking on your door, to deliveries, to phone calls, to your neighbor knocking on your door needing some help. So all of these things we did not face before in the normal workday. And so that really clouds sort of what the workday looks like, because you're juggling so many different things at the same time. Feels like every moment you have to be productive or doing something. And we don't really build in time for recovery. A big one that I'm also seeing and hearing a lot of people struggling with is sort of these feelings of guilt, right? We're feeling struggles, we're feeling stress from this transition to working from home, but we feel guilty about vocalizing those negative emotions because there's so many people who don't have work, and so many people who have to face the world head on in order to do their job. And so this causes us, many of us, to not want to express our negative feelings or want to express ourselves. And so what do? We bottle it up, and the stress only gets bigger, right? And so these feelings of guilt are very real. And I just want to say that you're allowed to feel stressed about work, and you're allowed to have negative emotions about work. And in fact, communicating about that is really what's going to help you reduce that stress. So don't let those feelings of guilt, because of however you might be feeling one day, prevent you from talking about it with someone who you trust. Also, we're working longer hours. Even before the pandemic, Americans especially are pretty well known for working 40 plus hours a week, and not really sort of having that built-in self-care or recovery time. We just work a lot, we always have. But the difference is now that work is happening in our spaces, in the spaces that we also do everything else in our lives. And so not only are we working longer hours, we don't have too much of a change of scenery these days, but you also might be seeing that whether you work 8, 9, 10 hours in any given day, you might not be seeing the productivity that you would normally see when in that same amount of time. I don't know about you all here today, but there are some days where I can get a whole lot done in 8 hours. And then there are days where I can barely get half of that same amount of work done in 8 hours. And that sort of lack of predictability in how much we can accomplish in any given day causes a lot of stress as well. And so that's a big one as well, is that not only are we working longer hours, we might not be as consistent in our productivity. And also we're distracted. It's hard to be focused when you're working from home. I know that many people have struggled with just staying focused for a certain amount of time in order to get something done. And that's really been a problem for many of us as well. And also using work or busyness as a distraction. And I caution you to be aware of that. And we're going to talk a little bit more about how to sort of stay in tune with that. But because we're dealing with such a high stress situation right now as a result of the pandemic, many of us are diving into work way more than we normally would. And we've been using it as sort of an emotional outlet. And that might work in the beginning, right? Because you feel busy and you feel somewhat distracted. But it's important to remember that the recovery process, the self-care, the taking time off is just as important to being productive in work as actually working. And so while using work as a distraction can seem like it works in the beginning, at some point that's going to lead to burnout. And that's what we're going to talk a little bit more about today. Busyness as a coping mechanism is not effective long-term. Another big challenge for people working from home is dealing with sort of your partner, whether they are working themselves at home or whether they're an essential worker. Or maybe your partner or spouse isn't working because maybe they've lost their job or have been laid off. And regardless of what situation you might be in, those situations can lead to some additional stressors and are just additional challenges to working from home. So the list is pretty long. We know that. And actually, I probably could have made this list a lot longer. For example, when we just start to think about logistical challenges, right? And so even though this list seems endless, We know this is challenging. We're going to get to some of the positive stuff in the end, or as we move through this presentation as well. So don't let this list overwhelm you. I just want to kind of lay out all the different things that we're struggling with right now. And on that note, I am going to take a quick peek in the chat room to see if maybe you've suggested some things that I didn't talk about today. Zoom fatigue, absolutely. Being exhausted from combining roles, focus and motivation, feeling like every minute needs to be spent in productivity. These are all some really real challenges. And the one thing I will say is I'm sure that most people working from home are facing them to some extent. So we are not alone in this. So despite all of these challenges that I mentioned, most people in the United States feel somewhat confident about their ability to work from home. And actually people in the Southeast, so those of you who are local to the UNC Greensboro and the South, actually we feel pretty confident about our ability to work remotely. So despite the fact that we're challenged, we're facing these challenges and we might be struggling to adjust, we, for the most part, many of us feel confident about our ability to still do our jobs. And that's a good thing. That's sort of a silver lining, right? Because if we didn't have that belief, then it would probably be even harder for us to maintain this long term. And as I mentioned, I will share these resources with you as well. So let's talk about some benefits of remote work. There's no way I was going to let us just kind of hang out in the challenges space because that's a little bit depressing, and we want to believe that there are some benefits to remote work so that we have some motivation to actually set those boundaries, right? So let's talk about some of those benefits. For many of us, working from home means we can work from anywhere. And actually, it's been really neat to see people get creative about where they work from. Many people are working outside, or many people have chosen to rent beach houses or go spend time with family. And so by having this flexibility, we might just feel a little bit more flexible in where we work from and how we do our work. And for many of us, that might be a benefit. Also, this was something that was mentioned in the video previously, but the fact that we're not commuting to work gives us more time and possibly more money in our pocket. And so just having some extra time in the beginning at the end of your day to spend on yourself. Maybe the time that you spent doing your commute, you can spend doing self-care. The bottom line is that working from home does give us a little bit more flexibility. But with flexibility comes the need to set boundaries, right? When we have a lot of flexibility, we do have to put some boundaries in place to make sure that we can stay productive and healthy within that flexibility as well. I mentioned more money in your pocket because of the commute, but also we don't spend as much money on getting coffee or going out to lunch. And more money in your pocket could possibly mean achieving some goals down the line. What else do you have to sort of suggest as a benefit of remote work? I encourage you to put it in the chat room, and we'd love to discuss it later on. So let's move into setting some boundaries. That's really why you're here today, and we're going to spend the bulk of today talking about some different boundaries that you can set and how to keep them as well. But this image that you see on your screen, I actually pulled it from an Instagram account that talks a lot about financial boundaries. It's at The Financial Diet, and most of the work they do surrounds around finances. But I saw this image and I thought it was very fitting for our discussion today. Because we often think of boundaries as a bad thing, right? It's often looked at as a reaction that we have when we're already in a negative situation. We often wait till we're stressed. We wait till things are chaotic before we say, hey, I probably need to put some boundaries around this situation. Just think about, negative or not so great relationships. We wait until we're feeling taken advantage of. We wait until we feel some resentment. And then the light bulb kind of goes on and we're like, oh, maybe I should put some boundaries in place. But imagine if we put boundaries in proactively. Imagine if we actually thought about intentionally implementing boundaries before we got to the feeling of negativity. What would happen to our lives? Well, we probably make the most of our time. We would probably prioritize the things that are important to us and fulfilling to us. So when you think about it, when we implement boundaries correctly and we keep them, they open up our lives instead of limiting it. And that's really important to note because we don't want this negative connotation around boundaries. They exist to make our lives better. So we're going to get into some different strategies to set some boundaries right now. And the one thing I will say is these are just general strategies that you can adapt to fit your life, or you can choose to say, you know what, that one's not going to work for me. My intention today is to give you a long list of things that you can possibly pick from, so you have a toolkit of boundaries that you can set, but you might decide that maybe one or two might not work for you. And in fact, in the interest of true disclosure, as I was creating this program, there were a couple of boundaries that I thought, I'm not sure if that would work for me, but just because it doesn't work for me doesn't mean it might not work for you. So I encourage you to think about this as it fits in your own life, and also feel free to make some changes so that it fits your life the way that you want it to. These boundaries are intended to be effective for you. So the first one, designating a space in your home for work. And if you can't necessarily designate one space in your home, it's still beneficial to have a space where all of your work things go. So even if you're not working from the same place every day, it's still a good idea to have a space in your home where all of your work things go so that you can walk away from it when the day is over. I'm fortunate, for example, to have a home office. And even though I don't always work from it, sometimes I'm working from the kitchen counter, from the couch, from the backyard. I still end the day by putting everything in my home office and closing the door. And that allows me to actually put a literal physical boundary in place. Once I close my office door, I'm done with work for the day. Now, of course, we can't be perfect, right? I'm not gonna sit here and say that there aren't days that I don't open that door back up and finish a project or check an email. But for the most part, setting a physical boundary for your workspace is really going to help keep you in check for ending the workday on time and not going back to work. We want to set some boundaries around when the workday starts and ends. Another strategy is to be intentional about your technology use. And these can be really small changes that you can make. For example, closing your laptop at the end of the day so that you don't hear those email pings come through. Or if you have a work phone and you're able to turn off your phone at the end of your shift. By doing these little sort of things, that changing the way you use your technology, you can avoid feeling that lure of being tied in or being pulled back in to answer that email or respond to that work phone call. In addition, when we talk about being intentional about our technology use, many of us might have work phones or work laptops that we were given to work from home. And you might not have really set boundaries around only doing work from your work laptop prior to the pandemic. But now might be a good time to consider really setting those concrete boundaries. I'm only going to answer my work email from my work laptop. What that does is that keeps you honest in keeping those boundaries. So if you're on your personal laptop on a Saturday, for example, you're not tempted to dig into your work email and then before you know it, 2 hours have gone by. We're all guilty of it, but it's important to us to try to do as much as possible to prevent doing that. And being intentional about our technology use, while maybe not super important before, although I'll argue that it probably is always important, it's crucial now. Being intentional about how we use our technology is perhaps one of the most important boundaries we can set to make sure we don't overload ourselves and eventually get burnt out. But on that same note, technology can actually help us manage our time. And so I used to be a high school counselor in my previous life, and I would always tell my students that the most effective way to reduce stress is to manage your time. When we manage our time and we feel like we are being productive with our time, we feel tons of emotional benefits. We feel productive. We feel proud. We have our self-image is positive because we're getting things done. But also we reduce stress. So when we reduce our stress, guess what? We're more productive. So it really is a cycle that we want to be a part of, right? We want to manage our time so we feel less stressed and we are more productive and we feel better about ourselves. So while time management is often overlooked, it's a really effective way to set some boundaries around work and life and thus feel less stress. So one way to use technology to manage your time, I'm just going to give you some examples of things that I've seen work for others and have worked for me, but I encourage you to share some other ideas in the chat room as well. So for example, a lot of my work is project-based, which means that while I do have deadlines, I don't necessarily have to submit something by 5 p.m. on any given day. So one thing that I've started to do in this pandemic is I'll set a timer for myself. I'm gonna give myself 2 hours to work on this project. If at the end of those 2 hours, I'm not done entirely, I'll still take a break and I'll still walk away. And I'll be honest, if I don't set those timers, I don't always walk away. And so I've really been using the alarm and the timer on my phone to keep me honest about getting my self-care in and getting my breaks in. Another thing that setting timers around your work really does for you is it helps you assess your productivity that day. So for example, if I allot myself 3 hours to do something, and at the end of those 3 hours, I'm not even close, that maybe tells me that I might need to change some aspects of my strategy around that project. Do I need to instead work on it first thing in the morning instead of in the middle of the day? Do I need to turn off my other distractions in order to finish this project? So technology can really be a useful tool in managing our time, keeping us productive, but then also holding us accountable for taking the breaks that we need to take and that we normally would take if we were working in an office. If you think about it, when you report to an office, you go to the bathroom, right? You take a bathroom break. You might walk down to the water fountain to fill your water bottle. These are all built-in breaks that we have to be intentional about now when we're working from home. And another one that I think is very helpful, at least for me, is sort of making lists and setting goals for your week. And so when we talk about goals, they can be work related. For example, I'm going to do these projects, I'm going to finish this by this day. But it can also be goals around how many hours you're working. So one thing that I've started to do at the beginning of each week is I will ask myself, when am I going to start my workday? When am I going to finish my workday? Of course, it's hard to be 100% consistent with that, right? But it gives me a boundary, a goal to work towards. So if I said to myself, today I'm going to try to just work from 9 to 5 with my 30-minute lunch break. That keeps me honest and making sure that when it's 4:59, I'm shutting down, right? Now, there are days where I've got to stay on a little bit longer, and you might too. What's important is to set these goals and have a plan to try to achieve them, but to not feel like all is lost if you don't. This pandemic has taught us a couple of things, and I think one of the foremost themes that I'm hearing when I talk with people is it's teaching us flexibility and adaptability. Those of us, myself included, who were very rigid in our agendas and in our appointments and making sure we were accomplishing everything on our to-do list, we're having to learn that it doesn't always work out that way. So while I'm sitting here telling you, make those lists, set those goals, I'm also saying, be flexible and don't beat yourself up if you don't achieve 100% of them. It's really there to give you a guide and to have, to make sure that you're at least trying to set some boundaries around what workload looks like, when you start, when you finish, when you'll take a break. One helpful thing to keep in mind when you're setting goals for yourself, and this is just something that I do, at the top of my list every week, I'll always write, do the best you can with what you have. And that's just a reminder to me that if not every box is checked off at the end of the week, doesn't mean I'm a failure. I tried, right? And that just helps me build my list for next week. So setting goals and making lists is a good strategy, but it's not going to be, it's not something that you should be very strict about, especially right now. And finally, let's talk a little bit about, our remote work schedules. Many of us had schedules before the pandemic. We took our lunch breaks. We showed up to work at the same time every day. Maybe we did the same thing on a particular day each week. For example, maybe Friday mornings you make your phone calls to clients. And as much as possible, you want to try to mirror your remote work schedule to your normal work schedule. So if you took a walking break, I know that in my office, prior, when we used to actually go into the office, many people like to take walking breaks. And so if you did that before, I encourage you to do that now. Our bodies really get used to the routines that we set. And so if you can mirror those routines, you're going to be more likely to be productive and to sort of keep the same level of productivity that you did before. So as much as you want, as much as possible, you know, we're not going to be perfect here. And I think that's the overall message that I want to send today, is to give yourself grace and to know it's not going to be perfect, but there's still some things we can do to try to at least get as close to perfect as we can, right? And perhaps our routines are more important than ever now. I mentioned earlier, one of the challenges that we're facing is that we're working at home with our partners and our spouses, right? Or our partners and spouses are not working, and that's a whole other element of stress as well. And so as much as possible, working together and communicating with your partner and spouse to set boundaries is going to be crucial here. So this can look like communicating about when you have a call that morning or when you have a Zoom meeting, to ensure that maybe you're not talking over each other, right? I know that in my home, my husband is a teacher, and so he will do his live classes first thing in the morning, and then I do my live webinars shortly after. That just keeps the stress in the home a little bit more low key. We know we're both not live at the same time, so you know, when the dogs start barking at the mailman or when someone is dropping off a delivery, one of us can field those things and just minimize stress. So as much as possible, kind of working together to get your schedules aligned so that you're not over talking or stressing each other out as you do your work. And if your spouse is maybe not working because they have been laid off or lost their job as a result of the pandemic, then maybe those conversations center around what you might need in terms of additional support while you're working. Maybe you need your partner or spouse to handle lunchtime with the kids, or maybe you need them to take the lead on making sure that the grocery shopping is done. What's important is to continue to communicate openly and to tell each other what you need. Many people are sort of really experiencing some relationship stressors right now as a result of the pandemic. And so openly communicating is going to reduce that stress for both of you, personally and professionally as well. Another way to set some boundaries is to adopt a ritual. So I mentioned earlier about sort of maintaining your work routine as much as you can. But maybe also adopting a new ritual is a great way for you to kind of tell your body and your mind that you're starting and ending the day. And so I've got a good friend who she has taken to starting her workday and ending her workday with a walk. And what she does during that walk is she sort of decompresses in the same way that she would decompress on her commute home. And so when you sort of adopt a ritual and you are consistent in that ritual, your body and your mind get used to that, right? And so whatever that looks like for you, whether it doesn't have to be a walk, it can be that, you know, one of my rituals is I mentioned earlier that I'll close all of my things in the office. Well, I'll just kind of rearrange my desk. I'll make a list for the things I want to do for the next day. And then I very sort of ceremoniously close the door and am proud of another day done. So I'll tell myself, you did it. You've gotten another day under your belt with this pandemic. Now close the door and do something for yourself. That's my ritual. It might feel a little silly, but I actually look forward to telling myself the day is over. Now do something for yourself. So whatever your ritual looks like, I encourage you to just do something, you know, it could be 1 minute, 2 minutes, but do it at the beginning and at the end of your day to help you sort of get in the mindset of whatever it is that you're planning to do next. So for sort of full disclosure, self-care and exercise are important all of the time, okay? But they're especially important during a pandemic. And so self-care, I look at it as sort of a medicine for many things. Not only does it sort of help us stay in tune with our emotions, help keep us grounded and balanced and patient, all things that we want right now, it can reduce stress and sort of help us conduct self-inventories on where we're at, either physically, mentally, emotionally, spiritually. So when we spend time on ourselves, that's a boundary that we're implementing for ourselves, right? And the repercussions of that are so much more than professional. They bring us personal fulfillment, but they also strengthen our other relationships as well. So an effective self-care routine is always beneficial, not just during a pandemic. And HRI does have a number of self-care resources that we've developed that are both pandemic specific and not. And so we'll share those with you as well. We encourage you to check that out because I think we could probably spend an hour just talking about how to start your self-care. And then, of course, moving our bodies. We're home now. We're home a lot more than probably most of us are used to. And we're sort of not doing just basic exercise that we normally would take for granted. Walking, taking the stairs to your office, just in general, getting your steps in. I know that, one thing that people often do will be to just walk around their building or make sure they're standing at their desks. But maybe we're not doing those things as intentionally right now, and you might be feeling the physical and the emotional repercussions of that. So whether you go for a walk, do a virtual yoga class, whatever that looks like for you, when we move our bodies, we feel less stressed. So that sounds pretty good to me. Another useful way to kind of set boundaries is to figure out what other people in your industry or on your team at work are doing. So networking looks a little bit different now, right? Now we want to hear what people are doing that's working for them. And in fact, a lot of people are getting really creative about the strategies that they're putting in place to help manage the load. So I encourage you to connect with people in your industry, connect with people on your team. Ask them what's working. Ask them what they're struggling with. Many of us don't have to recreate the wheel with these strategies that we want to set. We just might want to talk with other people and get ideas from them and then adapt what they're doing to work for us. When we talk with others, we just get new ideas and we keep it fresh. And it also sort of helps us see how other people are coping. I don't know about all of you tuning in with us live, but I know that when I hear about somebody else maybe struggling with a particular aspect of remote work, it makes me feel better to know that I'm not alone in that. And then, taking that conversation further and saying, hey, I think we're both struggling with this aspect of working from home. Let's maybe brainstorm together on some things that can work for us. And then bonus points if you agree to hold each other accountable for that, right? Maybe you connect with a team member and you say, hey, this week we're going to log off at 5. We're going to get our work done in time to end the day at 5 p.m. And then making sure you hold each other accountable for that. But in general, having a support system and tying in other people who are experiencing the same thing as you is going to help you set some boundaries and keep them as well. So prioritizing family time is a huge part of setting work boundaries. And the reason for that is because before the pandemic, we might not have had to take great strides to spend time with family because you sort of have the evenings, right? And you have your evening routines. And maybe you knew that when you weren't at work, that time was for family. But what happens when work and family happen at the same time, right? We might overlook that we need to sit down at the table with our family, even though we're all together at home all the time, right? And so when we prioritize that time right now, that's going to help us sort of do the things that are fulfilling to us and keep our stress levels down. I often say that one of the best ways to combat stress is by having fun with your loved ones. And prioritizing that right now is a great way to set some boundaries, as well as motivation to set those boundaries. I know that I'm highly motivated to keep my boundaries when I know that at the end of it, I've got some fun time in store with my husband and my dogs. And so that's something to keep in mind. I think oftentimes during times of stress, we cut out fun and family time first because we think other things are more important. And of course, basic needs, right? Making sure our kids are fed and are sleeping, those things are important. But making sure we feel love and connection are equally as important to keeping us sane during these crazy times. And of course, this one, taking time off is probably not applicable for everyone, but I encourage you to think about whether this would be applicable and helpful for you. Some people might find that it's beneficial to take some time off if their employment allows. And time off doesn't necessarily have to mean, you're going to take a full week. Maybe it just means that you sign off 2 hours early on Friday and spend those 2 hours with your family. Sometimes that's what it takes to rejuvenate yourself and refresh yourself. And so what's important to know is our employers, our supervisors, they're experiencing this pandemic along with us. And so when we're open about our needs, especially when we might need some time off, not only are you taking care of yourself and setting your boundaries, but you're potentially letting your employers know that there could be other people on the team struggling with that as well. So however you choose to use time off, if you choose to take it, whether you use it to prioritize your self-care or whether you use it to kind of work on that home project that you've been wanting to, time off could be a good option if you're having a hard time setting some boundaries. It could be sort of your reset button, right? So if you've got the ability to do that and you've got the freedom to do that, that could possibly be a strategy to consider. Through the Healthy Relationships Initiative, one of the things we really want people to know, and one of the things we're really hoping to sort of attack head on, is sort of to get rid of this stigma of asking for help. And if this stigma was alive and well before the pandemic, it seems to be flourishing now, right? It seems like people are afraid to seek out additional help for whatever reason, and all of them are very understandable right now. But the bottom line is, if you're struggling with your level of stress or with just coping with this pandemic, we need to ask for help. Whether you reach out to a trusted loved one, or whether you reach out to your spiritual advisor, or maybe you've decided that you need some counseling. When we go to someone else for help during stressful times, that's the best thing we can do for ourselves, right? That's a whole other level of self-care. But it also helps us keep those boundaries. It brings somebody in to hold us accountable, but also to help us sort through what boundaries we might need to set in order to just feel better about a particular situation. It's important to note, to asking your employer for help might be what you need as well. So some examples of kinds of help from your employer might be, is there a way to work out that where you could work different hours? Maybe you've got 3 kids and you just can't work that 9 to 5 like you normally would. So can you work different hours to accommodate your family home life? That could potentially minimize your stress. Maybe if you're working on a particular project and you need additional hands on deck. Basically what we want to do right now in all aspects of our lives is communicate our needs. We want to ask people for help with what we need. We also want to offer that help as well. Bottom line is, don't suffer alone. Don't let it sit there and stew, because that's only going to increase your stress and make it less likely that you'll set and keep boundaries in the long run. So this one is so important. Taking your days off seriously. Whether it's the weekend or whether you took a day off, take it. I can't say that enough. I think before the pandemic, maybe this was a little bit of a looser boundary because our lives had many layers of activities, and maybe you were busy and on the go. So scrolling through your phone and checking a work email maybe was not as significant as it is now. Although I always recommend taking your days off. You've earned them, right? But when we don't take our days off seriously now, what we're doing is we're risking using busyness as a distraction. And I mentioned that earlier as something that we really want to caution ourselves against. It's like when athletes are training for a marathon or a big game. I highly doubt that they are training 7 days a week, right? Because the recovery process is just important to your performance as the actual work that you're doing. And the same goes for work productivity. There's a lot of research to back up the fact that people who spend time focusing on themselves and on their loved ones, and who take those days off, take that recovery time, are actually more effective and more productive and more creative in their work. So take those days off seriously. Don't check your phone. Don't check your work email. Don't give in to that temptation, right? Because remembering that recovery is just as important as actually doing that work. And so the next one is wearing work clothes, and you'll see a little asterisk there. And that's just because that's one of those things that it may or may not work for you. Some people have really vocalized that getting ready for work in the morning helps get them in the zone for work. And it doesn't necessarily have to be that, you're wearing a suit for your Zoom meetings, but maybe it means, you put on some khakis or a pair of jeans just to feel like you're actually working. I will admit, I'm not quite there yet with this particular one. I really enjoy working from home in PJs, but I will admit today I kind of put on some work clothes for you all today, and I had a pretty productive morning. And so, that's one of those things that maybe you don't put your work clothes on every day, but maybe you dress for work on the days where you really need to be super productive. For some people, what we wear really influences how we feel. The next one has to do with saying no or saying not right now. And I would argue that we probably all need to practice this one a little bit more. And so many people are sort of perceiving this working from home thing as just having extra time to get things done, right? But that's not necessarily the case, because we have many added on priorities that we didn't have before. We're parenting, we're fielding the stress of living through an unprecedented time. We're adjusting to working from home, and then also adjusting to having everyone be home. So sometimes that means that we might have to say no, or I don't have the bandwidth to take this on right now. One important thing to note about saying no is that you might need to say no to your professional relationships, but also your personal relationships as well. Some of our personal relationships can be really exhausting. And so, sometimes you might have to say to that friend or to that family member, I can't get on that Zoom call today, or I can't do you that favor today. I've got too much going on at home. And to not feel guilty about that. I think all of us would benefit from getting into the habit of saying no a little bit more. And the other thing to really consider here is, I think the pandemic has brought on this idea that we need to be overly available. We need to answer emails in real time. We can't miss that phone call, right? But really, we might want to consider that we likely don't need to be overly available right now. Yes, all of us are staying home. Yes, we're probably connecting a lot more to our email than we normally would. But that doesn't necessarily mean that you need to respond to them right away. So for example, if you were a teacher, or if you're a teacher before this, a face-to-face teacher before the pandemic, you probably were not answering emails in real time because you have kids to teach in front of you. So it doesn't necessarily have to mean that you have to answer them in real time now. Of course, we need to be available and we need to continue to complete our work duties. But do you really need to step away from your lunch to answer that ping that just came through? No, you can finish your lunch, right? And so just remembering that just because we're all home doesn't mean that we're all constantly tied to our devices all the time. So give yourself some grace there. You can answer an email 20 minutes later, an hour later. Of course, we all know the details of our own job. So don't go out and, not answer your email for a whole day if that's going to get you in trouble. But just keep in mind, we don't need to be there in real time all of the time. So I've given you some strategies to think about boundaries you can set. And hopefully from that list, you have about at least, 4 or 5 things that you can adapt and make work for you. But a boundary is irrelevant unless we keep it, right? We can come up with a whole list of things that we're going to do. If we're not putting things in place to keep those boundaries, we're sort of wasting our time. And so the first thing to really remember, boundaries are up to us. And I know that's sort of in a way, I guess, a cop-out for some of us, because we can really not hold ourselves accountable if we want to, but ultimately it's our responsibility to make sure we do that. And so one way to keep ourselves in check is to conduct some self-inventories about sort of what we need and to make sure we're staying on top of that. And we'll talk about that more on the next slide. I've mentioned often here today, communicate with your loved ones. And that involves letting them know what boundaries are important to you and helping and asking for their help in that. So one of the things that I really struggled with in the beginning of this work pandemic is signing off when I said I was going to sign off. I would say I would sign off at 5 and then it's 6:30 and I'm still doing, work-related things. And so I started to ask my husband for help in that. And at the end of the day, he will gently remind me that it's time for me to step away from my computer. I'll be honest, some days I receive that better than others, right? We're human. However, he stays consistent in reminding me and I'm more consistent in signing off. So that's important, to seek out the support of our loved ones to make sure that we're keeping those boundaries in place. Another way to really keep boundaries is to focus on your self-care and exercise. There is a correlation between when we prioritize our self-care and our exercise, we prioritize all of the other things too, right? When we put ourselves first and we take care of ourselves, we're better for others, and we're better and we're more productive in other spaces. So while I mentioned that self-care and exercise is a boundary that you can set, it's also a way to keep the other boundaries that you set as well. And so finally, let's talk about some self-inventories. And the most important way to think about this is when we don't set boundaries, we feel stress. When we feel stress, that seeps into other aspects of our lives, but we also see some physical and emotional repercussions of that as well. So what you see on the screen is a list of some warning signs that maybe you're not coping as well with this remote work, and maybe you might need to think more intentionally about your boundaries, or set some more, or change the ones that you're setting for yourself right now. And so one way to really do this for yourself is to, and I encourage you to do it after today's program, make a list of the things that you typically feel or that you typically do when you know you're very stressed. So for example, when I'm stressed, my sleep is affected. So I know, hey, if I've woken up several times in the middle of the night, there's something else going on, and I really need to be in tune with my own stress. So thinking about whatever that means for you. We know that some of the warning signs of stress is that we feel more hostile and angry towards others, but also towards ourselves. We feel this sense of time urgency, and that's something that's really been prevalent in the pandemic now, is just being highly aware of time or the lack of time, right? Watching the clock and recognizing, oh my gosh, I've only got 10 minutes to do this. That's a warning sign of stress, to be highly aware of time. Also, perfectionism, right? Expecting perfection from others and from ourselves, holding ourselves to these unrealistic standards is a sign that maybe we're not coping very well. Feeling disappointment in our productivity, and also being unable to shake it, right? We all have bad days. There are days where I get to the end of the day and I'm like, man, I didn't do half of the things I should have done. But if I can't get over that the next day, if I can't kind of bounce back, that tells me something about my stress level right now. Some other examples are feeling like you're underachieving, and maybe also actually underachieving, missing deadlines, seeing a decrease in your quality of work. In your relationships, it can look like not really having the energy to try, or not having the energy to fix issues when they come up. These are all signs that we're not coping well. And so whatever your list looks like, make it and come back to it often, and use that as a way to check yourself. Use that as a way to make sure that you're preventing burnout in your own home. And if I've missed any signs of stress here, I do encourage you to just let us know in the chat room, because I think it's important for all of us to kind of communicate about the different signs of stress, because it looks different for all of us. And one important thing to note is that if you are really struggling with these symptoms of stress and possibly even depression or burnout, please seek help. And we do have some resources through HRI as well. But the bottom line is that when these signs become overbearing, and you feel like you can't bounce back or shake that off, so to speak, seek professional help, because unfortunately, the signs of stress and the signs of depression can be really similar and can be confusing to us as well. Thanks for tuning in to my webinar today. To learn more, visit www.guilfordhri.org.